Well, everyone, thank you for joining us as the inaugural director of the Elahé Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you all to today's special event featuring Professor Samhita Shunya's Conference of the Moths. I would like to extend my gratitude to the Canadian Society for Iranian and Persian Studies and the Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute for sponsoring today's event and supporting the establishment of the Institute. My particular gratitude to Dr. Elahé Mir-Djalali, who has joined us here today. At the outset, I also like to express our personal and collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the Elahé Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron Mandat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across the Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn, and teach under ancestral homeland. My colleague, Bilal Hashmi, the administrative coordinator of the Institute, will be introducing our distinguished colleague.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tawakoli. Colleagues, we're extremely privileged and pleased to have with us today Professor Samhita Sunya from the University of Virginia. And it's, for me, a great personal and professional honor to introduce her. We've known each other for a number of years, and so it's wonderful that she could grace us with her presence today. Professor Sunya is an associate professor at, in the Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of Virginia. She is the author of Sirens of Modernity, subtitled World Cinema via Bombay. And this book came out from the University of California Press in 2022. It's an account of the widespread international popularity of Hindi song dance films during the Cold War era, particularly the 1960s. Raised in Houston, Texas, by South Asian immigrant parents, she has lived and worked in India, Lebanon, and Turkey. Her scholarship has been praised for its quote-unquote rare vulnerability, for its focus on histories of love and cinephilia, and for the trans-regional and global dimensions of its historical research. Her first short film, which we'll have the privilege of viewing today in this very special screening, is titled Conference of the Moths, and it was released in 2024. I believe this was the official selection, one of the official selection films at the Reorient Festival in Oregon last year. The film itself draws, we'll hear Dr. Sunya talk about it, but it draws on her familiarity with an array of artistic, literary, and cinematic genealogies of poetry and visual cultures across South and West Asia. Dr. Sunya's film, like her scholarship, is driven by the conviction that such genealogies and stories have so much to offer contemporary filmmakers as we seek to render not only the world that we live in, but also the world in which we aspire to live. That was the official bio statement that I have, which I read rather clumsily. But I want to say, as an additional biographical note, that when I had the privilege of being Dr. Sunya's colleague at the University of Virginia some years ago, I could not think of a more militant champion of Iranian cinema. And by this, I mean not in the obvious ways of teaching and curation and acquisition, but the smaller things behind the scenes, so to speak, behind this film is by Parda Productions, but behind the Parde, the kind of things that happen. And I was really struck by that during that year that I spent as a lecturer at the University of Virginia. And this involved things like, the care that we'll hear about today in film and in the discussion. It's really reflected in Dr. Sunya's approach particularly when it came to Iranian film in a place like Charlottesville. This involves hosting filmmakers at one's home and taking them around the city and looking at posters and promotional material, making sure things are translated in the best way possible, and those smaller things that come with the circuits of film distribution and viewing, and of course teaching. So I wanted to mention this aspect of Dr. Sunya's Iran Dosti, which this audience particularly will be pleased to learn about today. So without further ado, I would ask Dr. Sunya to please talk to us a little bit about the film, which we will then screen, and then this will be followed by a discussion and Q&A, if you permit. Thank you.
So as a thematic note of gratitude, I'll just say that one of the things I had written out was that one of the many ways in which the motif of the moth and flame appears in Persianate and Hindustani poetry is in its associations with the mehfil, or gathering. Sometimes the lover is cast as a moth among those who flock to the mehfil and end up mesmerized by the presence of the beloved, whose radiance is like that of the flame, as both the spiritual and romantic metaphor. Or, and not unrelatedly, lovers of poetry and music emerge as moth-like, and such expressive forms themselves emerge as the beloved flame by which the moths are irresistibly drawn in, and if touched, irrevocably transformed. So this pop-up special preview presentation of Conference of the Moths can only be described as a mehfil-e-khas, an extraordinary gathering, and it has been made possible by the otherworldly generosity of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies. So hence the 1,001 thanks to Director Mohammad Tawakoli, Administrative Coordinator Bilal Hashmi, Research Associate and Cinema Iranica Manager Sophie Farouki, and graphic designer Mehtab Rafi, who created this beautiful event for the beautiful poster for this event. And thank you to all of you, both in person and online. So I must begin with the confession that no Iranians were directly involved in the making of this film. So what I'll tell you a little bit about is some connections, given that this is an Iranian Studies Center, that the film has both personally and academically, intellectually, research-wise. And I really look forward from this audience to learning more from as well through the course of this conversation. For those of you who, just to remind you, the film that we're going to be viewing is a very short film. And again, I'll say more about the production of it as well. The film, as many of you may have read, is a kind of gentle parody and homage to the 12th century epic poem Conference of the Birds. So what brought us to this tiny team who decided to make this film? For myself, I grew up in South Asian American diaspora in one of the best cities in the world, Houston, Texas. My parents are actually of South Indian background, but my mom especially was a lover of Indian classical music, particularly, and as a kid kind of dropped me into the lap of a teacher who happened to specialize in the Hindustani style of classical music. And she and her husband were like a second set of parents to me, and that community was a community of musicians. Herself, she was actually of South Indian background too, but that included Indians, Pakistanis, Iranians, Afghans. So the shared language in a way was music. And between that, like sometimes there are binaries drawn between like classical music and popular music, but in fact, a lot of even lyrics of Hindi film songs, which are a major focus of my work as a film historian, in thinking about, again, like histories of Hindi cinema. My book particularly focuses on the 60s. And the question of how do we understand romantic lyrics and poetry in the history of cinema and as being so central to the history of cinema. So in that way, I can read Hindi, but I'm illiterate in Urdu, and yet through the music, there was a sort of oral tradition, whether from playing with musicians who sing ghazals and learning and wanting to learn the poetry, that somehow a lot of translated Persian poetry, or sometimes even original language, if it was some compositions, were part of growing up. And then it was so easy to see motifs that were so present in South Asian popular cultures through, say, Hindi film song lyrics. So as an example, from the 1967 film Shamma or Parwana, the opening line of the lyrics of this film song, Sare Mehtil Jo Jala Parwana, and it's a kind of almost battle of the sexes between a masculine voice and a feminine voice, arguing, but in this very playful and even flirtatious way, about whether the moth or the flame is a truer lover in a way. So the co-writer of this film that we set out to make, co-writer, editor, composer, Ali Bandayali, is from the Ismaili community, of which there's a huge community in Toronto. So growing up for him, Conference of the Birds was something that all children read together. So, and I'll say more again about why we made this particular story, but for him also, through this sort of other or overlapping, but also a very, very specific relationship to that particular work, there was this connection that was shared. The guest artist, and I have to draw attention to this because to me, this was one of those most magical things about this film, was that the US-based Lebanese author, Rabia Alameddine, agreed as a guest voice artist to voice the Wise Hoopoe in our film. Rabia has such a long list of awards and accolades, but most recently, he was praised for his quote, powerful imagination on the page and his attention to every single word and sentence by Julie Enser, a member of the judging panel for the Whitehead Award, which is it's a lifetime achievement award given to an LGBTQ author to celebrate their lifetime of work and their commitment to fostering queer culture. And this award comes a few years after Alameddine's The Long End of the Telescope, which won the PEN Faulkner Award for Fiction in 2022. And please do look out for his new novel, which is on the horizon. It's beautiful. The true story of Raja the Gullible, in parentheses, and his mother. And we must add now to his bio that he is also the most beautiful hoopoe you have ever heard. The personal journey behind this film is that actually Ali and I were working through a separation that became final. And the themes of love in the film are also about finding love through new beginnings and change and transformation and in new forms. So this film was, and I say this just to say that this film was so embedded in a kind of process of working on something else. And neither of us ever made a film before. And it felt so magical to sort of see, how it came together. So in a way, it wasn't even necessarily intended from the outset to have an audience, which is why it's even more of an honor that I have the honor of being hosted here and being able to share this with you all. There's a joke that academics, and I mean, especially film scholars in particular, should never make films because they tend to sometimes inherit the bad habits of wordiness and didacticism of academic writing. So one of the kind of polls, if this was a transition into a new form of expression or thinking in a way, is that the genre of the parable or folktale offers and occasions and even revels in a certain dynamism, which is part of the genre itself. So maybe that's also something at work in terms of how this particular film unfolded. For me, as a scholar of visual culture, particularly in this transregional context, one of the most fascinating things to me, and again, here's where I can throw this out to this audience out of curiosity, over whether others of you have thoughts on this. But I get this sense that a lot of the classical motifs of Persianate and Hindustani poetry are so present in the visual culture of the region. The garden, the nightingale, birds, pomegranate, like these iconic motifs. To me, one thing that's very curious is what seems to be almost the virtual absence of the moth and the flame that is perhaps unique in that it's so present as a poetic metaphor, but seems to be relatively absent, if not, invisible in the visual culture. So part of making this film was also to bring that motif to the screen, and the technique of paper cutout, stop motion, silhouette animation is a technique that both allows us to thematize these motifs of light and dark that are very much at work in a lot of the poetry around the moth and the flame. And also that itself builds on a longer genealogy of shadow puppetry that goes back to Southeast Asia, Central Asia. So you'll see that homage as well. Yes, and so I'll just, before we watch the film now, I'll just say that in an era of AI and everything, a lot of animators, like professional animators that I've heard, who still do things like handmade clay animation or, again, paper animation. There's a certain way in which these things become sort of even more special as maybe I don't know if they're becoming rare, but certainly in all of the tools that are available to sort of render things, that painstaking way in which with stop motion, shoot frame by frame by frame by frame, where each motion is like a fraction of a second. There's something about the care. So in the same way that I mentioned that a lot of this film was much more a part of a process of trying something new that I had never done before in this very kind of artisanal production. Again, I didn't have a filmmaking background as much as I love cinema and have written about cinema. But I'm very much in violation of what I said earlier, that film historians should never make films. So I hope I can be forgiven. My best hope, especially for those of you online, is that you love the film, but maybe want to watch it in higher quality so that you will tell the festivals, if you have any contacts, that they might want to screen it. Regardless of that, again, I'm so happy that you're here. I look forward to learning, particularly from those who might have even more expertise period to lend on works like Confidence of the Moth, these longer histories of poetry, anything that speaks to you, constructive feedback, because this is the first time. Thank you so much for watching. As I describe it, it's a very small film with a very big.
Those haven't been hard one. So any questions? Truly is that happy. So your teacher, man.
Susan has a question, please. You can unmute.
Hi, that was amazing. I've never seen such a great combination of historical relevance with modern day issue in the way that you weaved it together. That was beautiful. Oh, did you have any influence or any connection with Zoroastrianism while making this?
Not directly or in an intended way. But again, I think the interesting thing is in a South Asian context, I don't want to say that it's, I think actually the history of this motif, particularly in a work like Conference of the Birds, I think it's important to talk about and emphasize how steeped it was in Islamic philosophy. And also at the same time, in a South Asian context, a lot of these motifs of light and dark, certainly in the popular culture, but also over like a long history of lyrics, it I think has come to blend associations with many, many different traditions and philosophies. So perhaps what you're speaking to is, that repository of reference points or philosophical motifs that come out of a lot of perhaps different traditions meeting each other. That I'm sure are embedded in even the context of a 12th century work like Conference of the.
Thank you so much for bringing the film to the U of T. I wanted to ask you about the process of making this film because you were talking about not being a filmmaker in practice. Kind of how did you approach adapting this work to a different form or a different medium? So which part of the process started first here?
A lot of it was just taking stock of what resources we had, and that means both personnel, like me, Ali, Rabia, who was kind enough to participate. What are our skills? Neither Ali nor I had experience directing actors or the sort of technical parts of lighting and cinematography, as much as I would love training in that. To start off with, we were thinking, okay, what skills do we have? Imparted from perhaps my grandmother and mother from a very young age, maybe too young, was a love of scissors. And so I've always loved to, cut paper and sort of make things out of paper. So I knew, okay, I can do this. And the other thing that was happening at the same time was just between me and Ali, these conversations about how the rhetoric of care in the contemporary world is often thought of as like commodities you buy. Actually, self-care is very important, especially from certain like feminist histories of definitely like with women being often overburdened with care work. This is not to throw that out, but to say that sometimes by commodifying care as like products you buy, there can be an increase in the conditions of why there feels like such an absence of care in terms of just like communal support or like kind of community care. So it's being a little bit playful with that, how oftentimes not wanting to tip care into a sort of self-absorption, but the idea in a sort of hyper-individualist and often a world of commodities, trying to remember that these motifs and perhaps our return to them, like the moth and the flame, is also about how much we need each other and how connected we all are.
Dr. Moshiri?
Thank you so much for great presentation and great movie. My question was, rather, I had a comment. I don't know what are you, how much of Attar's Mantiquatir affected what you made, because there are also a conference of moth within Mantiquatir. So there is a section that all the moth are gathered, and they send an emissary to bring something from the candle, a news from candle. So I wanted to see whether you looked at the imagery of moth within Conference of the Birds. And also, I think Susan had a point about Zoroastrianism. There is a point in Mantagoter which Attar says that the moth is fire worshipper. So it's not a direct reference, but nonetheless, there is a reference in that regard. But other than that, it was a wonderful film, and I also wanted to see whether you had a central message in this film, because to me it sounded like there was a point of conformity that, this is what you have to do, and you can go beyond the boundary of what you were created for. Anyways, thank you very much.
Thank you for that question. Again, so this is the way in which perhaps like my sense of moths, again, having read it in translation, is a little bit generalized and Conference of the Birds is a little bit generalized in Indo. So of course, as many of you know, as a sort of parable, Conference of the Birds, a lot of it is also about the pun at the end, like the simur, meaning semur. So how much we need each other on these journeys of reflection and understanding and experience and learning from experiences of life that transform us, that enlighten us. But I can answer that by just saying that it didn't directly engage with the passages that you mentioned. But a few of the things that are very striking to me about that motif, both in Conference of the Birds and in general of the moth and flame, are certain ambiguities and layers around it. So sometimes the moth is cast as foolish, like our foolish obsessions in some ways. So it's almost like the moths draw to the flame. It's like almost like an idolatry, like the things that we get obsessed with, that consume us in negative ways. And then sometimes it's the flip of that. This again, sometimes very Sufi idea of again, irrevocable transformation through the intensity of this experience that cannot be intellectualized, that sort of must be undertaken as a kind of embodied, experienced journey. And I think that ambiguity becomes really interesting to me, that we tried to bring out in this. But again, the thing is, on our team, we didn't have or necessarily engage with as much with, say, scholars who know a lot about Conference of the Birds. And that's something I actually look forward to. This is just a beginning, and sort of learning more about those who know that epic poem a lot better than I do, or have encountered it in other ways, like yourself, like to just learn more through this process of sharing it with people.
Thank you.
Discuss the ambiguity. Could you also say something about the irony that you are engaged with? It's really, I find that rather powerful throughout the.
Yeah, so in some ways, and in terms of what was the message, I don't know that I can answer that, because for me, and again, this wasn't something that was necessarily intended. Because as a film historian, I get really impatient when filmmakers are like, no, this was the point of my film, because the message is whatever it comes across as, like whatever the effect is. I'll come back to your question in a second, but for me, a lot of it was just trying to bring the moth and flame to, again, the visual culture, because it's been so absent. So just the sort of process of just playing with paper, playing with silhouettes, playing with the paper backgrounds to pay homage to this motif that, again, has been so ubiquitous and powerful in different ways. And to think about in that moment, what did this mean to us? Repeat your question, Megan.
You explain the ambiguity in the film, but I was wondering how the irony that you're engaged with is really present all throughout the.
Yeah, so there's a playfulness with how like
satirical too.
And that humans are sort of celebrating the moth for its like unyielding and kind of impassioned love of the flame, And the moths are looking at this suddenly like, why do humans keep killing us in their poetry? Why don't they just annihilate themselves in the name of what they love? So then, they write this poetry about humans annihilating themselves for their, well, because as if they're watching love of work, love of bad, overly processed food, a love of Botox, or no shame in that, but it's like an exaggeration of sort of a vanity almost, or superficiality. And of course, like as their poetry starts to spread, Hoopoe is horrified and calls the moths back. And there it's almost, I guess the way to put it, disaggregating a literal understanding of the moth and the flame to a more allegorical one, where it's not the literal light that burns the moth, but the kind of figurative light that, and that way it's not so much as the earlier question was saying about almost this, it is in your nature and you're almost like you're pre-programmed to do something, but more that this is where, like moths are drawn to light, perhaps more allegorically, we're all drawn to connection, even as sometimes like modern light for life can cut those that feeling off, like from the sense of interconnectedness that we may much more inherently be drawn to, and hence perhaps the persistence of that motif of the moth and flame now over centuries.
I think the film has a powerful image message, particularly in the age of Trump and Trumpism. It's really educational.
I mean, like, again, both like the entire making of this film that was made, 2023, 2020. Absolutely, that, in any time of like intense difficulty, grief, crisis, what holds us down? And oftentimes it's just the people that you're with that make such a big difference. So I include all of you that.
Dr. Fayaz has a question online, please.
Hey, Samhita. So great to finally see your short movie. We've always talked about it, so we're colleagues in the same department. It's so great to finally see it. And also, hello to everyone, especially Professor Tavakkoli. Earlier, you have said hello, and I couldn't say hello back because I'm in the middle of a reading room where everyone is busy doing their final essays, I think. Anyway, so I just had first of all, it was so brilliant. It's so well done, the animation, because there is not only the image of the fire and the moth flying, but the circular motion, right? The moving of things coming together and zooming in and zooming out. That was so beautifully done in terms of visual. We all know what the moth and the fire and the circling around means in the, poetic form. But to visually see it, it's quite interesting because the poets could comprehend the motion of the moth around the fire, right? So they're capturing a real image that makes into poetic image. So it's not the first time that we are basically killing the moths in order to, convey a kind of human experience. We have done it a million times. Kalila in Dimna is a great example of that, right? Animals coming to teach humans and they're being sacrificed for the sake of an ethical purpose. But the one question or one comment really that I have is about the fire itself, that it's quite an interesting juxtaposition because yes, fire worshipping is just so much part of the sort of Syrian culture, but it has a widespread use in every other culture. The Greek Romans associated fire with the heart, right? The human heart was always considered to be fire. That's where all the emotions, right? All the four elements, the heart is the fire, right? So in this image, the moth is not only sacrificing for the sake of the light, but there is a self-worshipping is happening, self-sacrifice, right? They're falling into their own heart. They're falling into their own desires, right? This is ultimately what the image is telling us. So there is, it's the more you read it, the more you break it down, the more it makes more interesting suggestions about this inner annihilation that's happening, the inward journey. So it's quite interesting. I think the image has so many layers of meaning when it comes to poetry, especially within the conference of the birds, because it's a forward movement toward the sun or toward the God or divine, right? Finally getting to the destination of the sun or the light, really. So many allegories fall into place, including the moths, to signifies, like giving us a very short synopsis of what's going to happen, what's the ultimate journey entails. So this is quite interesting, but more importantly, I think your animation is just so brilliant. It's the flame falling short and then coming bigger, and then the moth circling, a conversation is happening, a physical motion is happening. So it's so all encompassing. It's not only in the words of poetry, but also the image is moving that conveys that poetic, I think. So yeah, thank you for sharing.
Thank you so much, Parwana. And again, we're neighbors, and our offices are right next to each other. So it's nice at this crazy point of the semester. This might be the longest time we've spent together in a long time. I will say again, thank you. I really appreciate your comments. It means a lot to me. And I have a hunch about this question that I started off with, which is the curious way in which the moth and flame seem very absent from the visual culture in a way that other motifs are much more present. Again, I can't think of anything that's similar in that way. Even like Khalila and Dimna, like you see that represented visually, for example, or other animals as well. But my intuition about this is that there's such a profound or embedded understanding of this particular motif of absolutely abstract, as in it's not about the literal like moths drawn to life, but that it always shows up in or it often seems to show up in poetry as an abstraction, as especially allegorical. So that's my hunch. The other hunch could be that it's actually a material thing, where to paint or draw things at night might also, just the techniques of say ink or paint or sort of other, that could also be part of it. But again, like, especially if there are any art historians out there that might be able to weigh in on this, I would love to know more and be very curious. But my hunch is it builds on, I think, some of Parwana, your comments about, again, all of the layers of this motif historically, that is one that is particularly embedded in a certain philosophical abstraction or even esotericism, like the idea of, the moth that merges with the flame never comes back. So it's like the irrevocable transformation, but that can only be experienced. It can't be just, told or known through hearsay.
So we do have an art historian with a question, but before we get to that, Leila Muslimi is one of our PhD students. Leila, before your question, if I can just ask in the room, I believe Yasser, you had, yeah, so please, if you can ask it. Yeah.
Thanks for your movie. If you start your movie with kind of philosophical question, philosophical dialogue, as you may know, I thought partially with against philosophy. Even say the philosophy, infidelity is better than philosophy. As it say Farsi, کاف کفر اینجا به حق المعرفه خوشترن آید زفای فلسفه، چون که این علم لزج چون ره زند بیشتر بر مردم آگه زند. And I was wondering whether you wanted somehow criticize Sufism or establish Iranian, because you called to read.
No, not at all. It's actually entirely an homage to that work. But I think where maybe the point of connection is again this this thread of perhaps the critique of philosophy, and I know less about this, certainly from Potter, like I don't know much about that, but I also can imagine that, again, this motif, it lends itself so much to what you might think of as imbuing certain strands of heterodox practices where there's a critique of orthodoxy, and but sometimes like what's leveled against that is certain again embodied mystical experience, and that's sort of almost like reacting to sort of the overly orthodox traditions of yeah. So when I say parody, what I mean is the parodies of humans, like of ourselves. Like it's not a parody of or when I say gentle parody, it's also to say that, you know, we're having fun with these characters in some way. Like you probably, you know, reading a conference of the moths, like if I don't know if any of you know Mir-Djalali, like he's like a very trickster personality in some ways. So even to have him as the wise hoopoe, it's so beautiful, but that's sort of the fun that we were also having with this. But it's not intended to mock at all. And I also think that sometimes in those polemics, then the other question becomes, so what is philosophy? And you know, of course, like in those moments around those polemics, it can be that for utter philosophy meant a very particular thing rather than generally philosophy.
But here you are mocking radical self-exposure.
Yeah, you are. Oh, we're mocking ourselves.
Leila, please.
Thank you so much, Belaljan. Thank you so much for wonderful animation. I'm a big fan of animations, and I always watch different animations, and I'm sure that your animation can be shown in the museums, in the purpose of education. And my question is that the complexity of the story is. We know the complexity of the story, and we know the simplistic style of the animation at the same time, but it is very simple, but at the same time, because the narration is very complex, it makes it very attractive. I wanted to know that if children can have a sympathy with this animation.
I hope so. I actually feel like oftentimes, you know, children's animation can be very profound because I don't know quite how to put this, except that children are such emotional creatures in a way that, you know, like films that they may not know it in terms of, say, like narrative or philosophy or lessons, but perhaps just the experience itself, again, the colors, the silhouettes, the light and dark. Children, I think, can be very attuned to that, the music, sort of those elements. Again, there was no intention in terms of this is for adults or for children, but it really means a lot. And I really appreciate this comment that you found that juxtaposition interesting, that there is a utter simplicity of the animation style, but that the messages that the film is interested in are more profound as well, and that I'm open to anyone watching it who would like to watch it. But I again really appreciate that comment.
Thank you.
We have a question from Manik Mir-Djalali.
Yeah.
But before we get to that, if just one moment, I wanted to look around. Was there anyone? Yes, please. Yes.
If I want to jump back to the earlier, I would just say it was a very interesting film, and I think like a concentrated kind of text really requires, as I'm realizing, I think it would require multiple viewing to really appreciate it. As with any classics, the text, right, it would require a lot of reflection to unpack levels of the allegory. I think, well, firstly, just kind of connecting back to the earlier, and think it's an interesting way that the poem of the moths against, so right, the moths' critique of humans gets explained, so to speak, right, by the people, by the wise. And so that that's to me is very soothing to kind of, because on the one hand, as we're watching, we kind of agree with the moth's critique of the humans' self-obsession. But then you realize, well, but then what? So what, right? That's what I think that's part of the message. And the delivery of it, for me, so I always appreciated the structure of medieval storytelling, with the framing, the framed tale, which pervades Arabic and Persian and all that, right? Like various literary cultures. And there's circularity to that. So that's where I think the animation format, the circling, actually visually kind of evolves the circularity of the nature of structure. That was interesting to me. I don't know if you can think about it. I'm curious whether that was something that you were thinking of consciously. And lastly, just on the rhetoric of the self, I loved, as much as it was, and I noticed it was repeated several times, right? The string of self-care, self-absorption, like whatever these buzzwords now, right? And I'm just kind of curious to hear, like, was that something that you were deliberately, right, invoking all of the rhetoric of the self in contemporary discourses?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that comment. Absolutely. One thing that was very intended, and as you said, a lot of medieval works that I'm familiar with that have this didactic parable-like structure, there is a lot of repetition. And we kept that both in the images, like there's been in a short film, a lot of repetitions of the same images. So for example, the images of the humans and their different, what they love, kinds of things. There's the repetition of that. There's repetitions of phrases, like of the animals, that image from at the beginning and at the end. So in that way, that's also part of the homage. Like again, this is a very small paper animation, but structurally, that sort of sense of repetition. And this is the other thing, my dear friend Anjali and I were talking about this earlier, that my music teacher actually once said something that I thought was very profound, that I keep thinking of now, especially as a teacher of cinema in this moment, where once when I was having trouble improvising, she said, you just have to play or sing the line over and over and over again and let yourself get bored. And as you get bored, you'll find ways to wriggle out of that. And so the kind of lesson there was how important the experience of boredom is for creativity, for reflection. And that's something that feels very absent these days. Like in teaching cinema to students, it almost now, compared to say 10 years ago, feels like trying to teach mindfulness, because students are not used to watching something that they didn't choose and that they can't change the channel on as it starts to become not interesting. So to sort of sit through that is, I think, something that I really try to foreground in the pedagogy as something that in all the different directions each of us are pulled, we often don't have that time to like sit through and get bored in those ways that I think teach us a lot. So I think there is actually something to the repetition. Of course, there's a lot of spiritual practices that are around repetition, many of us are probably familiar with, but even in the structure of the storytelling that has that sort of circular nature and just sitting with something, especially again in this moment of a lot of transition and trying to do something new, just sticking with that painstaking process of the paper cutout animation, became in the end very meaningful as a beginning. And it's interesting, like there's, I think, some magic in that. Like, had we not done that, there's many of you in this room I may have never met. Truly. So there's like already like a way in which that to me is perhaps the most important thing, in that what this little film has occasioned.
Manik Pujwala,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Beautiful film animation. I was just thinking that there was another message possibly for some people, that if you get too close to the source of your illumination, you might also get hurt, and like a lot of these great people like Gandhi and our MLK, uh, Martin Luther King and all that, they get too close and they are willing to sacrifice themselves. I guess they. But the other comment was about the Zoroastrians. In Persian, in the Shahnameh, there is one verse which says, "Magui ke atash parastan budand, parastandaye pak yazda budan." Which means that referring to the Firdausi Tusi's Zoroastrian ancestors, he says that do not call those Zoroastrians as fire worshippers. They are worshippers of the holy God. And the thing is, the problem is that the word worship sometimes infers automatically to many people. That means the source, like fire, is the God, of the Zoroastrian, which is not true, right? The God in Zoroastrian is Aura Mazda, which is the wise Lord, because of the emphasis on wisdom and all that. So that's all. Thank you very much.
Okay. Go ahead.
Great. So, as Samhita was thinking, first, thank you, Mr. Bujwala. Professor Davari, please, if you could ask unmute.
Thank you so much, Sunita, for sharing the film and for the explanations. As early in the film, I was reminded of the work of the Ikhwan Safa, Brethren of Purity, the case of animals against humans. And because you said there's an influence of Mantahotair in the South Asian part of the world, I wondered if that was part of your inspiration as well. The case that animals would go to the jinn and say that the humans have been abusing us, and whether you were inspired by that story as well as the story of Mantahotair, and also because the animals lose that lawsuit against humans, would this story of the moth opposing the egotism of humans and all the spiritual ailments of humans today that you mentioned, self-care and Botox and all of those things, forgetting the love that they should be living in and being inflamed by, I wonder if it also centers human again and leads to further anthropocentrism. Thank you.
I mean, so the previous question and this, I think there's one bridge that I can say. So some have asked, like a few friends who I showed this film to, with the figure of the human falling into the mirror, etc., that image, did it come from Matisse's Icarus? I don't know if you know this painting of, but it's a man who looks like he's falling. And that wasn't conscious, but it is a really interesting point of reference. Again, this parable about the man who gets too close to the sun, so to speak, that's also in a broader range of stories about being drawn to your obsessions. Though again, of course, that comes from a different tradition, has a whole different set of valences. But I think there's sometimes in our very, very specific contemporary context, I think there's a lot of language about the fear of losing your hyper individualism. And it's not to, because I think there's also another way in which to, very, very problematic political ends, like self-sacrifice has been used in a lot of, even authoritarian contexts like that. So it's not so much about that, but also the importance of fearlessness, and understanding that difference of being open to the difference between these lights that draw us. Like, what are the ones that are sort of obsessions that ultimately become harmful to ourselves, and what are the ones that sort of bring out the light, so to speak? And this is not so easy to define. But this, again, simple story was a way of posing some of those questions. In terms of the anthropomorphism, yes, absolutely. I mean, this is in that vein of kind of talking animals. A lot of those stories are that way. But the hope was that playfully it would allow humans to look at ourselves with fresh eyes and almost asking this question. And this, to me, was sort of behind the film of, like, what is it about that motif of the moth and flame that compels us, and had compelled us in this long genealogy of poetry that has been so present again in all of these lyrics, from Iran to India and onwards.
So I'm mindful of the time. We have second questions from our audience members. I was wondering if anyone who hasn't asked a question yet, either in the in-person or online audience, would like to ask something. Okay, then we'll start with Susan, please, first.
Hi, I'll be really quick. I really love the simplicity of the animation and the thickness of the drawing, the actual strokes. Was that a decision that you made? And how did that come about? And just a really quick question. I'd love to know who sang the track at the end. It was lovely and really poignant. And I'm wondering, was that also influenced by your mom and the music that she listened to in the home? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, so I can clarify. The technique of this animation was actually they're paper cutouts. So hence there's a thickness to them, because especially doing this for the first time, if the paper is too thin, it's hard to move around. So they were basically paper puppets that are perforated. And as I said, that's also an homage to this long tradition of shadow puppetry that has been very prevalent in Southeast Asia, Central Asia. Then the music at the end was something that was just recommended by a friend, a dear singer, Washington, D.C. based Roxana Saraki, who's a Persian classical singer, and it was her recommendation. And that song is from very renowned artist, Sharon Nazari. So it might have been recognizable to some of you that it was her.
I had one more question. So as far as I'm gleaning, and please correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is people have varying degrees of exposure to the original text that kind of provided the lens through which to read this. And that's at a very certain kind of conversation in the room tonight. But I'm curious, because ultimately this is a film that will find hopefully itself in rooms, academic and otherwise. What your experience has been, if you've had that so far, taking this film to festivals or to students in other departments, and what their reading has been with no real knowledge of base text.
To elementary schools.
Well, this is just the beginning of the journey. For the most part, the people who have seen it were just very, very close friends whose main reaction were like, wow, I didn't know you could have made a film. And I was very moved by this and didn't expect this. It's sort of that kind of reaction. But I think what you're saying is, yeah, this is the first audience that I think actually has this kind of specialized knowledge and maybe familiarity more so than among the few audiences that have seen this with, say, Conference of the Birds. And that's where, again, I think I look forward to, if this film travels, like learning about what resonates with other people. I think, again, and I can come back to, okay, what does it mean kind of move from doing like scholarship in form of monographs, articles, and making something like this. And I actually feel like we have certain very, very human obsessions, intuitions that drive our scholarship that come from the deep wells of our personal experiences that sometimes aren't as foregrounded in the intellectual work that we take on. And so I feel like when I wrote my book and audiences engaged with it, I actually learned a lot about what my book was about, my own book, because I think there's ways in which you have intuitions that haven't even come to the surface. So in that way, even just from one of these early conversations, like I've learned a lot in ways that have crystallized over, oh yes, like this makes sense to me as something that I didn't maybe think of, but that sort of was underlying some of the preoccupations of this process a little bit.
If there are no other questions, I will leave it to Dr. Tawakkoli to make the final remarks.
Professor Sunya, thank you very much. And please push the limits of filmmaking. And we look forward to featuring your other films.
I hope so.
Really enjoyed it. Keep up the great.